I wonder how many people that were living in Galveston that survived that just instead of moving way away, moved to Houston.
1 out of every 6 people
was that
were
right?
in Galveston.
I think Galveston was one of, if not the fastest growing.
It was the biggest, which I actually, it's a tourist town now. I had not really realized it was the biggest.
God,
it was huge.
nuts.
It was 40,000 people.
This is part 2 of our story on the Galveston hurricane of 1900, still the deadliest natural disaster in American history. In part 1, we asked how a rising city failed to understand what was coming. Now we follow the story beyond the storm itself, into the aftermath, and into the harder question of what a society reveals about itself when order breaks down and survival gives way to recovery.
From prairie winds to courthouse doors, these tales run deep to the Texas core. With Texas tales, there's always more. So come chase the past with Lone Star Lore.
The immensity of the human damage is difficult to grasp. We simply do not live in a world where dozens, if not hundreds, of deceased human beings are left lying around in vacant lots and visible in the tangled mess of lumber everywhere. Most of them are totally nude, too. The force of the water and the debris constantly banging into them pulled all their clothing off, or pulverized garments. Once the waters receded, it left human remains right where they had been when the storm started to abate. Quote, "The waters of the Gulf and the winds spared no one. Men and women were thrown around like so many logs of wood. So were the small bodies of infants and children." The Lester Spillane document is full of pictures made right about the time of the storm. One is particularly haunting. It is of 12 toddlers and babies, all dressed up in white finery, with bonnets that matched their dresses and little sweaters and jackets. Several of the children looked to be African American, maybe one with some Oriental ancestry, and others white. In 1900, little boys wore dresses until they were about 5 when they were transitioned to long breeches. So it is difficult to tell the boys from the girls. They are all 12, just adorable babies and toddlers you would want to play with, hold, and love. They were residents of the Home for Homeless Children, and the caption reads, quote, "All of these little ones were lost in the flood," unquote. All 12 perished.
Having done Texas History Day, I have seen more depictions of the nuns tied to the orphans.
I know. That's the one image.
The number one image that all the little kids remember.
Wow.
Yeah.
That's and I guess it makes sense too, because then they learned you're not supposed to tie people together.
Would they have survived?
Right.
Otherwise, one little detail I remember reading, Clara Barton, they came expecting all these orphans. There are no orphans.
Wow.
Because the little kids, they're the ones who are going to die.
It wasn't just human bodies either. One observer reported that, quote, "The livestock on the island has been completely annihilated," unquote. So had all other animals. Those bodies mingled in the water with the human bodies. Quote, "Along the Gulf front, human bodies are floating around like cordwood among the carcasses of horses, chickens, dogs, and rotting vegetable matter. All of this organic matter began to decay immediately. It was wet, the sun began to shine the next day, and temperatures rose to the high 80s and into the 90s. The process of degeneration and putrefaction was well underway. At first, the city decided to bury the bodies, but there just were too many of them, and the ground was saturated from the storm. The trenches filled up with water as fast as the burial units could dig them. That plan was abandoned. It was even difficult to find enough horses to pull the wagons to collect the bodies. As the days dragged on, it became increasingly difficult to find workers for the body recoveries and burial duties. Another of the early methods of disposing of the bodies was to take them out to sea for burial. Quote, "Barges and tugs were quickly made ready for the purpose, but it was difficult to get men to do the work. Every able-bodied man they found was marched to the wharf front," unquote. It was so difficult to get people to handle the decaying bodies that workers, quote, "were supplied with stimulants to nerve them for their tasks," unquote. It seems that the Galveston liquor stores weren't all destroyed. Under the circumstances, that was a stroke of good luck. It became more and more difficult to get workers for burial duties. It also became unnecessary. The bodies started to float back in about as quickly as the authorities could get them hauled to the sea.
They didn't think about the tide.
Yeah.
And it's like, wow.
They took them out at like 18 miles or so. Obviously, it was not far enough. I'm absolutely amazed. I feel like they did sort of job well done that they did not have an outbreak of epidemics immediately in the wake of this. The first thing when they were trying to, bring the bodies out on the barges and weight them down, I'm like, well, nice try, but apparently a seaborne people forgot what happened when the tide comes in. But I can understand sort of the mentality of trying to do it at once, and then just having to burn the bodies, which of course is the reason that we will never know how many people died. They don't have dental records. They don't have DNA. There definitely was pushback of we can't identify the bodies as you're burning them, but they couldn't identify the bodies anyway. They barely could tell white from black after 24 hours. I mean, nothing looks quite as bad as a body in the water.
Avoiding an epidemic after a disaster on this scale may have been a genuine public health success. But success in one dimension does not erase what it cost in another. The coercion, the haste, and the brutal conditions under which those decisions were made. Still, the fact remains, with so many bodies, so much contamination, and so much heat, the absence of a major outbreak is striking. Why do you think there was not an epidemic that broke out?
I don't know. They move fast enough, honestly.
Okay.
What you are dealing with when you have that kind of a disaster is a two-punch. Actually, at least two. One is all the waterborne diseases because your drinking water is not safe. Now, a lot of people brought drinking water. There was a major rescue effort as soon as they could get into Galveston. But still, obviously the water table is contaminated.
Yeah.
And so you have all the waterborne diseases, and then you usually have all the mosquito-borne diseases. And they did mention that summer they were having a lot of mosquito problems.
Yeah.
And so all it takes is one person with infectious disease, and then you have the mosquito-borne diseases. It is actually, they move fast enough, obviously, because they didn't have some kind of an epidemic. That's still even true today. Immediately after an earthquake, immediately after a hurricane, things like typhus and cholera come roaring back.
Because of the fear of disease and pestilence, quote, health authorities decided upon cremation as an expedient, unquote. Fires were built all over the city to accommodate the constant need to rid the city of the dead. The stench of decay and the smell of burning flesh permeated the entire city of Galveston for days into weeks before the bodies were all consumed by the flames. Lester wrote, quote, perhaps some of the men engaged in this work are unknowingly aiding and destroying all that is mortal of some loved one, unquote. We can only hope they didn't realize it.
I know it upset people at the time. They were not used to cremation, but to me, you just simply have to do it. In some ways, it's not, to me, I don't see it. They probably did in 1900 as a lack of dignity. In some ways, it's more dignified. Lots of cultures throughout society, throughout humanity, have thought of cremation as the most dignified way to handle dead bodies. What is the least dignified is to just leave them on the ground. I mean, remember, 1900 is an incredibly prudish age, seeing all the dead bodies. And they look horrible because not only have they been in the water, not only are they nude, but then also they've just been utterly battered about.
Yeah.
In some ways, that is, I think, where you have this tremendous loss of dignity.
Yeah.
If this age period wants, and they have a lot emotionally invested in, being, not animalistic. And again, that's another sort of late 19th century, especially, poorer people or non-whites or people abroad, like the Cubans, are closer on the animal spectrum. Darwin is now kicking in, they know about Darwin's theories, and so you want to be, more refined means less animalistic. The condition of the corpses is very animalistic.
Right.
You've destroyed all their dignity.
Just throwing them all in the ocean is not that much different than
it's
burning
a burial
them.
at sea.
Yeah. What makes this part of the story so difficult is that no single explanation is big enough for it. The world of 1900 was shaped by hierarchy, racial thinking, and powerful ideas about refinement. But it was also shaped by religion, bodily taboo, sanitation fear, and the brute practical demands of a city overwhelmed by death. Under pressure, those forces did not compete so much as combine. And once dignity had been stripped from the dead, it did not take long for suspicion to turn toward the living.
A number of those forced to work on burial details were African American citizens of Galveston. The island population of 38,000 in 1900 was 38% black. When it became apparent bodies were being desecrated and looted, it was always the blacks who were blamed as the perpetrators. Only one account mentions whites looting bodies. Black looters were summarily shot if caught. In one case, 50 men were executed without trial, evidence, or any respect for their civil rights. A few days later, another 70 African American men were executed in the same manner.
Reading the aftermath, every single newspaper, every single account has stories that, as somebody who came through Katrina, sounded very familiar. Also as somebody who, again, might not seem like a weird comparison disease, but the yellow fever epidemic of 1793 seemed familiar, which is the blacks are looting the bodies and they are behaving like animals. And, again, this is kind of famous if you study early American history that people assumed that if you were of African descent, you had greater immunity. And so the blacks of Philadelphia got co-opted into basically helping take care of the sick and bury the wounded. And then they finally...
Because they were immune?
Because they were supposed to be immune. And this finally proved that, no, in fact, they're not immune because they died in great numbers. But after it was all over, rather than being grateful, all these accounts come out of them, robbing the dying or robbing the dead or, this lady, robbing a sick bed as the woman is lying dying in her bed. They're not quite as extreme as these stories, but it's still sort of that...
Draws a comparison.
Immediate. And, for Galveston, I think every single account had to have the fingers. Every single newspaper article that, the bodies were swollen, and so these ghouls, as they called them, they always made a point of the ghouls or Negro ghouls, are cutting off the fingers to get the rings, and they're cutting off ears to get the earrings. And this one guy who's found with 23 fingers in a cotton sack, and then of course that they are just lining them up and shooting them. And this is talked about with approval. Generally speaking, probably neither the ghouls nor the shooting actually happened. The whole thing was massively exaggerated. Coming out of Hurricane Katrina, rape gangs in the Superdome, that was 2005, the same really over-the-top stories. We really haven't gotten past that.
This is where the record gets difficult. Disasters do produce fear, confusion, and sometimes real disorder. But they also produce stories that travel fast, grow in the telling, and often reveal as much about a society's anxieties as they do about the events themselves. Which is why the historical task here is not to cling to one clean version of events, but to work through the uneasy ground between exaggeration and fact.
Disasters, natural man-made, tend to bring any tension bubbling up to the surface, but this is also 1900. The Tulsa is 20 years in the future. Yeah, this is kind of, as like I said, how many people were actually executed, probably wouldn't know because they basically don't care. I don't want to say they don't care, but they're not keeping record. They're not. It's not seen as in any way a crime, and so it would be very difficult to recover that information. I read it ages ago. I read Eric Lawson's book on it, and he just comes out and says, "What didn't happen?" And in some ways, I feel like the truth is somewhere in the middle.
Okay.
Because of course, lynching is an extremely common response in 1900, and in other words, there wouldn't even people. Literally every account does not see this as in any way problematic. That, if somebody was caught looting, and the assumption is they're going to be mostly black, but even if they're white, summary justice is meted out to them. And this really fits very much with the time, with the mentality of the time period. So I think it was probably exaggerated, but I also don't think it didn't happen at all.
What emerges from all of this is not a simple moral. Not that all fear was imagined. Not that all authority was justified, and not that catastrophe creates prejudice out of nothing. What it does reveal is how quickly a society falls back on its preconceived judgments about who or what seems dangerous, whose suffering counts, and which stories become easiest to believe when ordinary order begins to fail.
Another group that got conscripted was the looky-loos. We, of course, do public history at Texas State, and I'm not a public historian, but as I understand, tourism really is a later 19th century invention. It's interesting that dark tourism is right behind tourism because there are people who are showing up and they're sort of trying to throw them out because they want to see the corpses. They want to see the damage. And the leaders of Galveston have kind of two responses to them. First, they try to sort of shoo them away, and then they basically start grabbing them at gunpoint and putting them in the burial. You want to see the corpses? Here's your opportunity to see the corpses.
Get right in there.
Get right in there.
And the spectacle did not stop with the looky-loos. Within days of the storm, Edison-associated cameramen were already in Galveston filming the wreckage. In fact, some of the earliest surviving motion picture footage ever shot in Texas came out of the aftermath of this disaster. The Library of Congress record preserves Edison catalog copy claiming the photographers worked under martial law and risked being shot by police guards. Whether every flourish in that catalog can be verified or not, the larger point is clear. Catastrophe had become spectacle almost immediately. That matters because it reminds us how quickly catastrophe becomes public memory, and how quickly suffering becomes something not only endured but watched. But spectacle was only part of the aftermath. The deeper problem, as military officers on the ground quickly understood, was scale.
The Galveston disaster does have a timely ring to it. Major Lloyd Fayling, who aided Galveston with his troops, was asked for his report. In it, he said, quote, "The situation demands federal aid. It demanded it from the very first," unquote. Fayling closed the paragraph this way, quote, "The disaster is so great and so terrible, no municipal authority in the country could be expected to handle it unaided," unquote. Here is history, 125 years old, speaking to its government today. Faulkner was right. The past is never dead. It's not even past, unquote.
Major Fayling's report matters because it names a problem larger than Galveston itself. At a certain scale, disaster overwhelms local capacity. Not because a city lacks courage, but because some catastrophes exceed what any municipal authority can reasonably bear alone. And that raises another question the storm would answer in the years that followed. What happens to a city's future after a disaster this large? What survives? What shifts elsewhere? And how did the destruction of Galveston help accelerate the rise of Houston?
The way that I had heard this before was that sort of Houston was just sort of like this whatever type
They
place.
were neck and neck. Houston is inland. Houston
just didn't have the beach.
We now know, of course, Houston is also incredibly vulnerable to hurricanes. And in fact, Galveston historically has actually been fairly lucky. Maybe those late 19th, early 20th century people were onto something. It doesn't get hit as much as you'd think it would get hit.
Yeah, it sticks right
whereas
there.
Houston gets it all the time. Houston, I saw a list one time about the top 10 places that were vulnerable to natural disaster of one type or another. And Houston was actually quite high at the top because the city has grown so much and now so much of it's low-lying. The same problem New Orleans has. The part that was founded in the 18th century is on the high ground. As the city got bigger, it got lower. They started occupying a lot of place. Now, Galveston, it's very small. I mean, it's very compact. But to me, actually, it's surprising that Galveston didn't get hit by more hurricanes. Maybe there was something about that. Hurricanes naturally turn with the tides. They don't all do it.
Yeah.
Every now and then one might not get the memo. But Houston gets hit an awful lot. But Houston, as I understand it, very effectively made the argument that they were inland. And so once they could dredge, the canals, they could dredge the channels to get their supplies, they looked safer.
What Galveston reveals in the end is not only the force of nature, but the fragility of human judgment under pressure. In moments of catastrophe, public judgment rarely breaks cleanly along the line between truth and falsehood. More often, it breaks along the line between what people are prepared to believe and what they are prepared to fear. The storm exposed vulnerability, yes, but also hierarchy, limits, and the instincts a society falls back on when ordinary order breaks down. And that is why recovery is never only about roads, seawalls, or rebuilding a port. It is also about memory, about interpretation, about what people decide this disaster meant and what they carry forward from it. Our thanks, as always, to Joleene Maddox Snider for her writing and research. and to Dr. Shannon Duffy for her insight and perspective throughout this episode. If you value what we're building here at Lone Star Lore, please subscribe, share the episode, and help us keep this kind of Texas history storytelling growing. And if you'd like to support the show, you can find a link in the notes. Until next time, thank you for listening.
From prairie winds to courthouse doors, these tales run deep to the Texas core. With Texas tales, there's always more. So come chase the past with Lone Star Lore.